Welcome to FODI Digital, a weekend of conversations about the dangerous realities that surround us. I'm Danielle Harvey, the Festival Director of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. Last month, like so many events around the world, the Festival of Dangerous Ideas was no longer able to proceed due to the COVID-19 government bans. So this weekend, we pick up the conversations where we left off, and we have a look at what the added pressure COVID-19 has done to many topics that were already set to boil. In this session, Claire Wardle, the Director of First Draft, which is the foremost authority and researcher in mis and disinformation, speaks with ABC tech journalist Ariel Bogle about the conspiracy theories, fake news and misinformation that has all gone mainstream in the wake of COVID-19. You can join in by using the chat box to submit your questions. Claire joins us live from New York and Ariel is in Sydney. So please enjoy. Misinformation is infectious.
Hi, I'm really thrilled today to be talking to Claire Wardle. There are really few people better qualified to guide us through the swamp that is the internet during this COVID-19 pandemic. And as she was introduced, Claire leads the strategic direction and research for First Draft, a global nonprofit that supports journalists, academics, and technologists working to address challenges relating to truth and trust in the digital age. Welcome, Claire.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
So I thought we'd better start this talk by defining our terms. Can you walk us through the differences, the lines between misinformation, disinformation, and what I think you've called malinformation, and what we're seeing under those three categories during the pandemic online?
Yeah, so language really matters, particularly if we're trying to think about interventions and what we could do to help slow these problems down. But disinformation is false information when the people who are creating it or sharing it really do want to cause harm. And that is distinct from misinformation, which is also false, but the people sharing it don't realize it's false and they're not trying to cause any harm. So that might be my mum sharing something on Facebook without realizing. That is misinformation, and it's different to disinformation. This third category, malinformation, is this idea of genuine information, but the sharing of that might cause harm. So an example might be revenge porn, or it might be an older photo that's being pushed. It's a genuine photo, but the people sharing it are trying to cause harm. So we have to think a little bit about the complexity of this space if we're going to try and get a handle on it.
Absolutely. And I feel like since the 2016 US election and more acknowledgement of the role of Russian internet research agency during that time, there's a lingering desire to always blame the spread of misinformation on darker forces. I mean, sometimes that might be the case, but during this pandemic and the kinds of misinformation we're seeing online, what kind of actors are at play? Are there Russians out there, or is it just us?
So it is a complex space, and we have seen kind of phases around the coronavirus misinformation. So the first 2 to 3 weeks, we were seeing kind of the top 10 tips of things to do. You probably saw it: gargle with salt water. If you can't hold your breath for 10 seconds, that probably means you've got it. I mean, we all saw it, whatever country we lived in. We saw text messages saying your country is going to go into lockdown. It didn't matter if you were in Dublin or Mexico City. But then the last 3 weeks, we've seen a lot more conspiracy theories, which I think we're going to talk a lot more around. But we are also seeing countries pushing certain narratives. So at the moment, there's a tussle between the US and China about the origin story of the virus. So we are seeing different foreign entities using information. Some of that is, old school disinformation. Some of this you could argue is propaganda and trying to push your own narrative. But we are seeing everything right now, and we're seeing everything at the same time across the world. We've never had a moment where we've seen the same kind of rumors and conspiracies travel as quickly as we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. And would you put them in sort of buckets? I think you mentioned there that message that was going around here in Australia too, that was full of bad advice about how to protect yourself, gargling with water, keeping your throat moist, all bad advice for warding off the coronavirus. That was sort of in the health misinformation bucket. Then there's theories about where the virus came from. Is it a bioweapon? Was it released intentionally from a lab in China or even in the United States? That's another one. And now we're starting to see denial about whether the virus exists at all. are you seeing other sort of buckets of misinformation and disinformation here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen definitely the kind of how to prevent it, how does it spread, how did it start? So we've seen those kind of categories. And certainly at the beginning of this COVID-19 pandemic, we were kind of putting things into buckets. Now we're actually kind of seeing phases. And I think these phases are responding to how we as a public are dealing with this. So at the beginning, there was like, oh, this is something we don't understand. Tell me what to do to, you know, around my own health. But now we're seeing health misinformation intersecting with political disinformation. So particularly in the US, this whole, it's a hoax. This is the Democrats trying to steal the election in November. I mean, it's becoming a lot more fluid, but we're seeing these two spaces overlap. And I think that's just as the country is trying to respond to what to do. And as people, they're seeking explanations for their world being turned upside down, the economy being turned upside down. I mean, the impact has been so huge. And so unsurprisingly, people are seeking answers to try and explain everything that's changing in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe we can take one example and sort of walk through where it's come from. So at First Draft, you and your institution try to teach journalists how to verify information and teach them too about the paths these sort of conspiracy theories often take. You know, they might be formed in the darker, sort of more anonymous corners of the internet, message boards like 4chan. Then they go to conspiratorial communities. Then they go to broader social media and make their way to the professional media. Is there an example now that you can sort of trace that path for us so we can understand it better?
So I assume that many people who are watching this may have had somebody in their family or friendship group forward a link to a documentary called Plandemic, which is a perfect example of something that we've been tracking over the last 2 months. The term Plandemic was a meme. It was kind of connected to the anti-vax community, this idea that it was all planned and it was a deliberate attempt to force mandatory vaccinations. But we were monitoring it and saying to journalists, this isn't something you need to worry about. This is very fringe. But what we've seen is because this documentary, which is includes somebody called Judy Mikovits, who is an anti-vaxxer, although she says that explicitly she's not, but she's a scientist who had her research kind of pulled down from science. Her reputation was knocked, but she used to work with Dr. Fauci. And the reason that Dr. Fauci is such a important moment or important figure in all of this is that he bridges the left-right divide in the US. He's the chief medical advisor to Donald Trump. And so there's this attempt to pull down Dr. Fauci. And so this woman, Judy Mikovits, is part of that. And so what we've seen is these fringe ideas, this documentary that would have ended up not really being seen by many people. It's being pushed by a number of different the anti-vax community. We've seen other right-wing communities who recognize that this supports their agenda. And so it got pushed from very fringe communities through social media to the point that it started trending on Twitter yesterday. And when it starts trending on Twitter, you have journalists say, well, now we've got to cover it because it's reached the tipping point. And not only was it trending on Twitter, many people had their own friends and family share it with them. And that's when journalists say, we've got to step in and we've got to cover it. But now we have this woman's book, which is the #1 top bestseller on Amazon. And we have CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, everybody else, probably ABC, covering this documentary, which is causing more people to click on it, more people to ask questions about it, more people to Google. And whilst you will find some debunking content, if you stay online long enough, you will find a whole host of other videos and other material online telling you that this woman is the only woman who has the truth. And so it's really complex. It's a really good example of media manipulation. And it places journalists in a very difficult position because if they don't cover it, then people say, well, this is censorship. But it's, I think, a great example of the challenges that journalists face right now in dealing with conspiracy, rumor, and disinformation, because it's designed to get coverage by the media. And that makes it very difficult.
Yes, this idea of the tipping point is one that I think a lot of journalists are talking about now. When does a piece of conspiratorial content or something that's being discussed online warrant bigger coverage? And that tipping point is hard too, because I think as well there's this concept called pre-bunking. You know, you might see some misinformation starting to foment on the internet, and you might try out and get out in front of it, debunk it, so the wider public is sort of armored against it by the time it breaks into the mainstream. Can you walk us through that that idea and sort of give journalists, I guess, a report card, give us our grades about how we're doing at this during the pandemic?
So the challenge for journalists is that they never used to have to worry about false information. You know, journalism is about truth. So if it was a rumor or if it was false, then journalists are like, well, that ends up on the cutting room floor. That's not for us. But increasingly, research shows that audiences want newsrooms to help them navigate what's true or false. But this challenge is, if you've got a big footprint, if you're ABC or CNN, if you cover something, you've got a huge megaphone. So this question of the tipping point is, how do you decide when to cover it? Because if you go looking for misinformation on 4chan, you will find it and you could cover it, but you're giving it oxygen that it desperately needs and wants. But if you leave it too long, it's very difficult to pull back. So for example, in the US, we had this Pizzagate conspiracy, this idea that there was a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza restaurant in DC. I mean, insane. And all these DC journalists were like, well, we're not going to cover this. But by the time it was too late, and a guy drove up from North Carolina with a gun, there was a recognition that maybe people did believe this conspiracy. So the challenge for newsrooms is to figure out, how do you find that magic moment? And it's a mixture of how much engagement it's getting, not just likes, but are people actively sharing it? Are you seeing it cross-platform? So it's not just on Facebook, it's actually moving with velocity onto other places like Twitter or Instagram. Has an influencer or a celebrity shared it? Are other newsrooms covering it? And the challenge is that the tipping point for the ABC is different to the tipping point of a small local newsroom in a community. So everybody has to figure out that moment when they can say, actually, enough members of our audience have heard about it, and that we now have a responsibility to help explain it to them. But the last thing I would say is, it's very easy to think about just debunking the content. But Camille Francois, who's an excellent disinformation researcher at Graphica, she talks about the ABCs of disinformation: actors, behaviors, content. So rather than thinking, well, we just need to go in there and debunk the content, that's very difficult to do because of people's confirmation biases. What we should be doing is talking about, who are the actors pushing this content? Why are they pushing it? What's their worldview? What do they get from it by pushing those kind of rumors and conspiracies? And that's the kind of coverage that newsrooms should be thinking about. So I think your question about report cards, I think most newsrooms are becoming more thoughtful about it than they were 2 years ago. But the pressure is, you can be an incredible researcher, an incredible journalist, and you can go to your editor and say, I don't think we should cover the pandemic. And your editor might say, well, we're going to get a lot of clicks. And we have to recognize that, the way that the media has to operate, particularly now when resources are more scarce, there is a business element to this that we can't forget. So I spend a lot of time with excellent journalists thinking about this really critically, but I also understand that they have huge pressures inside the newsroom to do this kind of reporting.
So it's clear during this pandemic that a lot of people that are already committed to conspiratorial thinking, they're really dedicated to conspiracy theories, say around 5G, or they might be members of a strong anti-vaccination community. One thing they want to do is influence the media, get coverage in the media, but they also want to influence the influencers. I think it's been interesting to see the role of celebrity in all this. People, I think, watching will be aware of the 5G conspiracy theory, the baseless idea that 5G contributed or caused the coronavirus pandemic. And that really got a huge signal boost because of celebrities like Woody Harrelson. But can we talk about influencing influencer, and how you can't control the celebrity Instagram account, I guess, can we?
No, I mean, what I would do to do verification classes with some of these influencers, but we live now in a time where audiences for news are dropping. I mean, there are still, there's a lot of high levels of trust, particularly in countries like the UK and Australia. But in the US, for example, there are half the population who doesn't go anywhere near the professional media, but they do get a lot of information from their social media feeds. And partly they're getting that from friends and family, but they're also getting it from celebrities that we would recognize, like Kim Kardashian or Woody Harrelson, but also YouTube creators and influencers, or TikTok influencers or creators. And those people actually have huge audiences, and they are trusted by people who watch them every day, feel like they have a relationship with them. And so we often forget them when we think about the media ecosystem. We talk about the mainstream media, or we talk about friends and family, but these online influencers are a really important part of this ecosystem. And, you know, I once was talking to an agent of a YouTube influencer who said, yes, I'm really worried that my star is going to say something that she shouldn't do. I don't know how we're going to cope. I don't know how we'd issue a correction. And it was something that she really thought about. And she said, you know, she gets sent things all the time to retweet, and she doesn't do the verification. She's not a journalist, but she has huge influence and therefore responsibility.
I think this is sort of similar to a strong tactic in the anti-vaccination community over many years, which is sort of letter writing, flooding local politicians who might not be fully across the issue or the science. I mean, I guess, is this just a technique that once happened in sort of paper form, but now is become online, where you might barrage a comment section on Instagram or comment section on YouTube?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of brigading, which is essentially, you know, swarming an account. And we saw this happen to Bill Gates a few weeks ago. This idea that activists, online activists, congregate and say, right, at 6 p.m., we're going to make this hashtag trend on Twitter. Everybody's going to swarm this account. I mean, the thing about the internet is it's a really perfect mirror to humanity. And so most of the things that we see offline, we see online. And I would say, for example, we've seen a growth in text messaging misinformation around COVID. WhatsApp has become a real player in countries where that wasn't necessarily the case. It's been the case in places like India and Brazil, but not so much in the US, the UK, or Australia. But in those environments, you see people sharing with small groups of friends and family and saying, this might not be true, but I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I didn't send it to you. And it just reminds me of chain email letters. So it's the same old school psychology, which is with smaller groups of people, you're not as embarrassed. And so a lot of this is being shared by people who say this might not be true, but ... I mean, we have to hold each other account much more than we're doing to say, you can't do that, Mum. It's too dangerous to share things that have not been verified.
At the ABC, we've been inviting the public to send us examples of misinformation. And it's interesting, as you've said, a lot of it is occurring in private groups on WhatsApp or forwarded messages on Facebook Messenger, even in neighborhood Facebook groups or on Nextdoor, which is a social media network for communities tied to your postcode. Is there, how do you talk to somebody, your aunt, your uncle, your next door neighbor, in those groups where they are sharing stuff in that way? You said, I saw this, thought I'd share it, not sure if it's true. How do you talk to someone like that? And also, as the media, how do you cover it?
So the question of how to talk to one another is really, really important. We've invested quite a lot of money in media literacy training, but we haven't really invested the money in teaching one another how to have these conversations, which can be quite difficult. And the problem is sometimes if you see somebody sharing something, you might say, hey, Bob, I saw you shared that on Facebook, but it's actually not true. And here's the debunking article from the ABC, fact check. I mean, just to let you know, it's best if you don't share that. Now, you've immediately made Bob feel not great about himself. And there's a lot of psychological literature that shows that Bob is more likely to double down on his views. It's actually very difficult for him because he feels shamed to therefore say, oh, thanks so much for that. Let me read this. Oh, you're right. I was wrong. I mean, it's just not a very human thing for us to do. It's better off to say, hey, Bob, I saw you share that pandemic documentary. That's so interesting. I've seen it all day on my Facebook feed too, but I've really just worried about this kind of misinformation on our communities. And I'm worried about people sharing this information. It hasn't been verified. I mean, I think it's important for us to think about these things, but I'd love to talk to you more about why this is being circulated. Why is it being circulated now? Should we believe this? I mean, I'd just love to have a conversation with you. And so it's about using language like we and us and community, as opposed to I'm right, you're wrong. Like, we just have been doing it in a way that's not very helpful and doesn't really fit with the ways that our brains work. And we have to recognize that the information we share is very tied to our identities, and we perform those identities via the information that we share. So when you tell somebody that they're sharing something that's wrong, you're actually talking about the identity that they're constructing and the worldview that they have. So we have to be much more sensitive than we're currently being, and to recognize that fact-checking articles don't always do everything we want them to do, even though they should.
It's been interesting covering this too from Australia. I feel like when I see something going around in the United States, take that pandemic documentary that you were just talking about, I can see it getting passed around in Facebook. You know, in the US, I have relatives there. I can see them chatting about it. And I just sort of wait to see when it's coming to Australia, and it will inevitably end up here. It's sort of like wait for the export economy to like kick into action. This is truly a global event. I mean, what are you seeing around the way that misinformation is traveling? Is there a central point of creation, or is everyone just creating it all the time?
So who's behind this, as we discussed at the top? Part of this is kind of people making mistakes. And so you can imagine somebody hearing a rumor saying, oh, you know, my sister's a nurse, and what they're saying at her hospital is, and it becomes like an exaggerated game of telephone. So we're seeing quite a lot of that. But to your point, many of us now, we live in a global world. And because of that, we are in groups and communities. We have Facebook feeds where there are people from all over the world. And that's a really interesting moment for the quality of the information, because Australia has different rules to the UK, has different rules to the US. New York State has different rules to California. So people are sharing information based on what's happening where they are, but it's not always applicable in other places. So that's partly some of the problems that we have here, is that there isn't one centralized truth. There's no consensus even around some of the information we have about the coronavirus. So there is misinformation happening around coronavirus, but in many ways, there's just a problem with information. So we have a problem that even the researchers are publishing preprints based on very small studies of drugs that then all of a sudden get reported on as if that's fact. So I don't blame people for sharing misinformation or being confused by information, because the vacuums that we're seeing around the absence of quality information, they are being filled. Those crevices are being filled with misinformation. But the global aspect of this does make it more challenging, because we live in a global world, but this virus isn't necessarily being responded to in the same way across all countries.
So I feel obliged to bring up Donald Trump as a key voice in this. I mean, you just talked there about preprint research. So that's research, medical research that hasn't yet been peer reviewed, hasn't been subject to scrutiny by other researchers. And, you know, Donald Trump has been sharing research, you know, when he's promoting possible treatments for the coronavirus, like hydroxychloroquine, which quickly became, a source of much contention. What is the role of Donald Trump in all this? Because I think what he tweets, and he doesn't just influence America at this point, it also influences the information ecosystem here in Australia. And I wouldn't be surprised if every country in the world sort of feels those reverberations.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked about influencers, and he's kind of the ultimate influencer as the president of the United States, who also tweets more than almost anybody else in the world. But the challenge for journalists is people can't ignore Donald Trump. I mean, there were huge questions here about whether or not the TV networks should have aired or continue to air his press conferences live every day. My belief is that it should be on a delay, which would allow real-time fact-checking as he made those statements, because what he says gets amplified because he's the president, and many people who are not necessarily engaging with professional media only hear what he says. So when he talks about people drinking bleach or, you know, using injecting UV, I mean, let's not get into that. But it was at a level where it was easy to dismiss, yet there is evidence that there were people that believed that. There was an uptick in people who were, you know, going in with poison symptoms from taking different forms of poison, essentially. So I don't think anybody could have imagined a president who was pushing misinformation in real time and what that means for the ecosystem. And I think we're wrong to not talk about that. And if we just focus on the platforms and we don't recognize the importance, and it's not just Donald Trump, there are politicians around the world who are playing similar roles. And it's very, very difficult when you have misinformation online, but you also have very senior politicians parroting those conspiracies, and it puts journalists in a very difficult position.
So of course, social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, they all operate under algorithms which are, pretty hard to scrutinize, or impossible to scrutinize from the outside. But yet, trusted institutions, the World Health Organization or local hospitals here in Australia or the Department of Health, they have to compete in that ecosystem alongside Donald Trump, but also anti-vaccination groups, all kinds of spruikers of various information. Are our institutions losing the information war, and how can they get better at competing in those quite sort of confusing ecosystems?
So the huge challenge is that as humans, we have emotional relationships to information. But those of us who work in the quality information space, whether that's journalists, researchers, fact checkers, unfortunately, we like to think that people have a rational relationship to information. So I often talk about, for example, anti-vax communities really understand the role of emotion. So they are excellent at creating very emotive visual memes, very shareable, very clickable, and they're pushing this emotion-ridden content to people, and it's pulling on people's heartstrings about this is what happened when my baby was vaccinated. But then on the other hand, you have the WHO putting out an 87-page PDF with an image of a dripping needle on the front cover. Like, it's an asymmetrical playing field. And I would say that many health authorities are excellent at public health, not particularly good at communications. So we just aren't very good at creating content for the age of social media. So in the US every day, Andrew Cuomo from New York does a press conference and he's got a PowerPoint slides, and you see people like, oh, he's got good slides. Like, how in 2020 did we think that a good PowerPoint slide is the best that can be done? So I do think there's a long way to go in terms of teaching health authorities about how to create visually engaging, shareable content in the same way as those people who are pushing kind of emotive, it's not that we have to, it feels very difficult to think about emotion if you're a journalist, but we have to recognize that people on the other side are experts in using emotion.
Absolutely. So I just want to throw to one question from our audience, from Danielle. And, we've been talking about the actors in this space, but one is the social media companies themselves. How are they going at managing these deliberate mistruths that are being shared at this point? I know Facebook, they've all done a little bit. Are they doing enough?
So they've definitely done more around COVID-19 than they've done at any point up until now. And that's partly because there aren't two sides. There aren't people like, I want more COVID misinformation. So unlike anti-vax content, they can actually do this and be relatively safe. But the challenge is there's still no transparency around this. We don't have any oversight about what they're taking down. This is essentially Silicon Valley companies making these very big decisions. So on one hand, I want to applaud that they're making bolder steps, but I also worry that we are used to these bold steps without having the necessary transparency to say, how do we as a society feel about unaccountable corporations controlling our speech? So I think that's what we have to be careful about. Just because they're doing this with COVID, how would we feel if they were doing this for political speech? And I think what this shows is that we just need much tighter mechanisms in order to make these companies accountable. So
we're almost at the very end. So I just wanted to end with some instructions to me and to all of us. The pandemic is unlikely to be over. It's an ongoing situation. We can try and fix our information ecosystems while we're living through it. What are some things that institutions should do right now, and what can we as consumers of news do right now to improve what's happening online?
So I think we need to recognize that we're in a crisis situation. I heard somebody recently say, when there are wildfires in California, you listen to the police chief every day or the fire chief who says, right now the fire is here. Tomorrow the fire might be there, or there. I don't know, but follow my updates so I can keep you informed. And I think whether it's politicians, journalists, or any one of us, we have to realize that what we know about this virus is slippery. There is no consensus yet on so many things. And so we have to recognize that because of that, we need to keep updated, but we need to be very careful about what we're sharing. If we're sharing anything, whether you're a journalist or whether you're my mum, why are you sharing it? What do you hope to get from sharing it? And what are those unintended consequences? Because the information we're sharing right now is having real world harms. This isn't just political speech. This isn't just, oh, politicians again throwing mud. These kind of rumors are having real world consequences. And I think all of us have to recognize that if none of us shared any of this stuff, we wouldn't have a problem. We have a problem because we are sharing it. And I think that's what I wish we would all realize.
So a pause before you hit that retweet, I think, is maybe one of the takeaways. Thank you so much to Claire Wardle. She leads strategic direction and research for First Draft. And if anybody wants to know more, I really do recommend checking out First Draft. It's got endless resources about how to improve your understanding of the information ecosystem that's operating online in 2020. So thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. The next session is the ethics of the pandemic at 1:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time.
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas and FODI Digital is presented by the Ethics Centre. Our purpose is to bring ethics to the centre of everyday life through public experiences, education, thought leadership, advocacy, consulting and leadership programs. As a non-profit organisation, every single dollar is invested in pursuit of this purpose. Thanks to our donors and partners who help to make our programs happen. And you can donate via the website. Thank you.